when I say we live in times of revolution, we do. And I said that a time of revolution is a time when people are forced to challenge the things they take for granted. So let me ask you something that you may take for granted. I haven't got time to, I'm not there with you to see how you're going to react to this, but let me ask you it anyway. I ask people all around the world this question. It's this: how many senses do you think you have? Senses, physical senses. I'll give you a minute to think about it. That's it. You can edit more time in here if you want. Let me tell you what people commonly say. What people commonly say is this: we have, typically, I'm not saying you said this personally, but typically, I ask people all around the world, typically what they say is this, that we have 5 senses. And somebody almost always say, no, there's a 6th one, which is intuition. Now, the 5 senses people normally mention are sight, hearing, touch, smell, and, did I say hearing? You know what they are, those 5. And intuition. Now, intuition is different. Because it's obvious what does the other 5 things. You know, eyes that see, ears that hear, and so on. Intuition, it isn't quite clear what does intuition. You know, intuition is a kind of spooky sense that girls have more of. This is what we're told. Well, I came across a great book recently called Culture and the Senses, written by a woman called Catherine Lynn Geertz, G-E-U-R-T-S. She spent a lot of time with a group called the Anglo-Ewe peoples of southeastern Ghana. They had never thought they had 5 senses. Actually, they'd never thought to count them. That's what I found interesting. We live in a culture in the West where we think if you can't count something, it doesn't count. They didn't count them. They couldn't see how you'd make the distinction. So, once you counted them out, they said, well, what about the other one? And she said to them, what do you mean, the other one? And they said, well, the main one. You know, as you're counting senses, why aren't you counting that one? Now, this is a real sense which you have, and not some residual thing that happens to have survived in southeastern Ghana. You know, we all have it, but we don't count it. I'll tell you what it is, as time is shown. This is the sense of balance. Now, balance is fundamental to our human functioning. You know, you can't sit up, you can't stand up, you can't lie down properly, you can't get around without a sense of balance. Some of the problems for people with physical disabilities hinge around the sense of balance. It's fundamental, but we typically don't list it. And we don't list it not because we haven't got it, but because we spent our entire lives being told we have 5 senses, and that's it. So we take it for granted. You know, it's a question we don't bother asking anymore. We think we've dealt with it. Well, actually, you know, a physiologist will tell you you don't have 6 senses either. You have 9, maybe more. You might think about what the other ones are, but I'll tell you a couple. One of them is a sense of temperature, which is totally different from a sense of touch. A kinesthetic sense, which is knowing where you are in space. Pain is different from the sense of touch too. I mentioned Bart Conner. He's an Olympic gymnast. They depend totally on balance and a sense of kinesthetic orientation. They call it air sense. You know, if they flip off a beam, they need to know where they are at any given moment in space. You know? I mean, we can all flip off a beam. They just happen to know where the floor is, you know, which is a good trick if you can do it. So now my point is this: if we underestimate our basic senses and take them for granted, what else are we taking for granted that's also untrue? Well, I think what we take for granted primarily is our sense of intelligence. We've grown up with this limited view of ability, a massively inflated sense of disability, a sense of remedial education for people who don't demonstrate the conventional competencies, and it's rooted in an equally narrow view of intelligence, which we have reduced to a certain type of verbal and mathematical facility, particularly a certain sort of critical reasoning, and a certain type of verbal eloquence. My whole argument for the arts has always been that they represent a much more diverse conception of human intelligence. I think we know these things about intelligence. One, it is diverse. We experience the world in all the ways we experience it. I mean, we think about it in all the ways that we experience it. You know, visual artists aren't compensating for a verbal deficit. They're thinking visually. Dancers aren't compensating for some mathematical deficiency. They are thinking kinesthetically, and often, by the way, mathematically. So, the great testament to the diversity of human intelligence is the plurality of cultural practices, not only, but including the arts. It's self-evident to me that diversity should be a watchword of the future regeneration of human resources. Not similarity, but diversity. Secondly, human intelligence is tremendously dynamic and interactive. Dancers think mathematically. Poets think visually. Scientists often think visually and spatially. And the third thing about intelligence is it's extraordinarily unique to each of us. We each have a unique profile, which is what the element is about. Now, so let me just wrap this up and say that, to me, disability art is a test case for how we think about human ability. Not our own, but more broadly. But both of the terms there, disability art, are difficult and troubled. The term disability is too rough cut, I think, to really deal with the nuances of the issues that we're trying to address. You know, I mean, the field includes people with physical disabilities like polio. It includes the deaf community who often don't think of themselves in quite this way at all. I mean, cultures are defined often by languages, and there are languages within some fields of the so-called disability community which are distinct to them. And by any definition, this is a different sort of culture. We're talking about survivors of the mental health systems. These are different sorts of nuanced capacities and challenges that we need to think of properly before we start to sloganize, I think, the field of disability arts. And the second thing is the term the arts itself is troubled. If you ask people to define the arts, that's when the argument starts. You know, it goes from what we think of as high art, our ballet and classical music, to street culture, to rap, to every form of creative practice. So the term disabled art, to me, is a problem, because it suggests something that's unified when what we're trying to promote is homogeneity. And it's based on, I think, two things I want to conclude with. One is that because of this conception of ability, and particularly since the 19th century, I think we have pathologized physical disabilities and other sorts of what we might think of as impairments. We've pathologized them and ghettoized them. And part of what the disability arts movement is about is liberating people's natural capacities to different sorts of creative practice. And I think that's exactly what we should do. But we've also, just as we've pathologized disability, we've professionalized the arts. It's only quite recently the arts has emerged as a separate profession, you know, with their own social security numbers and passports with artists written on them. So I think for the future, as I take it, this is really the big theme of Momentum 09, part of the conversation should be to recognize the subtleties and complexities in these two separate domains which are beginning to merge here, and not to impose a homogeneous view or set of aspirations on them, but to recognize that people are involved in them for different sorts of reasons.